Eddie Canestracci here! And no, that's not clickbait. I do have proof that, according to Angus Young anyway, Bon Scott wrote a little bit of Back in Black. What's a little bit? And what's going on with Angus, because he changes his story a lot when it comes to this. And this isn't anything new. This quote's been out there for a long time. I'm going to talk about this quote. I'm surprised it doesn't get discussed more, actually. In the whole Bon Scott wrote Back in Black conspiracy circle, it definitely gets talked a lot about. And yes, Jesse Fink, who wrote Bon, The Last Highway, has cited this quote many times. Although, the first time I came across this quote from Kerrang magazine was on an AC/DC fan message board, and then subsequently I read it on a Steve Hoffman forum, which was also debating this issue. So this quote was already out there on the internet before Jesse Fink dusted it off. And of course, there's a lot of other stuff about this book, The Last Highway, which I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about all the big theories and quotes and things people have said that believe that Bon Scott wrote the lyrics to Back in Black. And I'm going to talk all about that, and I'm going to address all the so-called evidence that people have that Bon wrote the whole album, which obviously Bon Scott did not write every lyric on Back in Black, and I think the evidence that I'm going to throw at you will prove that. I can't speak for Jesse Fink and some of these Australian people that came out in the past, that were connected with Bon Scott. I can't speak for them and their agenda, but I can say in terms of fans, if you're a fan and you just love Bon Scott, hey, more power to you. I love Bon Scott too. And in fact, he's like one of my all-time favorite singers. Bon Scott's in my top 5 favorite singers of all time. But here's the rub. So's Brian Johnson. Yeah, I don't want to have to choose between Bon and Brian. I love them both. I'm a fan of both eras, the Bon Scott era and the Brian Johnson era, especially this era that's like right on the cusp, Back in Black. For those about to rock, we salute you. I'm going to talk a lot about that album as well. And so just know I'm a fan. If you love Bon Scott, I think that's great. If you love Brian Johnson, I think that's great. If you love both of them, even better. Let's talk about Jesse Fink and his book, Bon, The Last Highway. Came out a few years ago. Yeah, I read it when it came out. Of course I read it. It was about Bon Scott. He's one of my favorite singers, one of my favorite people of all time. He's one of the greatest lyricists in rock music, in my opinion, and just a really cool, funny guy. I love watching his old interviews and his old clips ever since I was an adolescent in junior high. Yeah, I've been an AC/DC fan since junior high. So yeah, a book comes out and there's all these people that knew Bon back in the day. Ex-girlfriends, ex-friends, what have you, a former manager of AC/DC. They're all helping Jesse Fink put together this image of Bon. And in that regard, I think the book was very successful. Actually, I do recommend this book. It's an entertaining read, and I think you get a lot of insight into Bon, even more so than the other AC/DC related biographies I've read over the years, because this mainly focuses on Bon Scott and not the entire band. And as a result, you really get to know Bon as a person, not just a fun, cool rock and roll guy, but the more vulnerable and troubled man behind the scenes, behind the curtain. And again, in that regard, I think it's a really good book. There's a problem, however, in my opinion, when Jesse Fink keeps leaning into the conspiracy of the Back in Black lyrics. His journalistic criterion of what he accepts as a legitimate source is very shaky. Okay, for one thing, he's got like an ex-girlfriend who won't even give her name. It's like Holly X. Okay, some ex-girlfriend. Bon Scott was a rock star, right? He had a lot of groupies. He had a lot of girlfriends. The love of his life was his ex-wife, Irene. She's probably the woman he wrote most about. And then there was his girlfriend, very stormy relationship, Silver Smith, who is one of the people that was interviewed for this book and had a lot to say. She since has passed away. But Silver Smith is a very controversial figure in AC/DC circles. For one thing, she was a heroin addict. She was a well-documented heroin addict, aka a junkie, who the band hated. Malcolm Young and the others hated Silver Smith and thought she was a horrible influence on Bon Scott, being a drug addict and also being somewhat of an undependable person, which makes sense. She was a junkie and kept on causing Bon a lot of pain, actually, a lot of heartache and pain, and he wrote a lot about her. Gone Shootin', for example, in Powerage, to me is clearly about Silver Smith and what he's feeling, the torment he's feeling being in love with this junkie. But she was very beautiful and stylish and hip, and he was really crazy for Silver Smith. Smith. But Holly X, I don't know. I can't say. It's just some woman who won't even give her name, claiming that, oh, Bond was so into her. And it's like Jim Morrison. You know how many women have come out and said, oh, I was really the love of his life. This woman claims that Bon Scott wrote You Shook Me All Night Long was all about her. Yeah, it just happens to be like the band's biggest hit. It was all about you, because she was American. And there's that line about American thighs. Hey, Brian Johnson hadn't even been to America. Oh my God. And then there's that whole bit about what is it? What is it? Yeah, chartreuse eyes. She had chartreuse eyes, and she says that's what sightless eyes was meant to be, chartreuse eyes. But the band changed it because they thought people wouldn't understand chartreuse eyes. This is the problem with Jesse Fink. He's using that as evidence. Okay, so some ex-girlfriend, someone that claims to have slept with Bon Scott, is claimed to be a woman that Bon Scott loved in America, where he pretty much just went when he was touring. He spent most of his time between London and Australia. But anyway, so this woman says that, oh, these lyrics were all about me, and even the lyrics that didn't exist, like lyrics that she's making up. And she's using these made-up lyrics that are about her eye color. And Jesse Fink puts it in there. He puts it in there. There, further evidence. But no, that's called bullshit. That's not real evidence. And then, okay, a former manager says, yeah, he thought Bon Scott should have got a credit. Okay, former manager. Not their current manager. I.e., maybe he was fired by the band. I looked into this. I couldn't really find out much information about this manager. He was part of the larger management company that represents him. So we don't know how much interaction he actually had. It was a big management company. And then we got a bunch of old friends and blokes and a junkie ex-girlfriend. This is not the greatest collection of character witnesses. They all have an obvious beef with the band. They all have been squeezed out. They all have a reason to try to hurt AC/DC and Bon Scott's replacement, Brian Johnson, and to have the spotlight on them. And it's all hearsay. No proof. It's just such obvious bullshit. That's the thing. So much of Jesse Fink's book, even though I loved all the stuff about Bon and the revelations about his personality and his relationship with Silver Smith and all that stuff was really fascinating. And again, I do recommend it. But you gotta take all the fucking shady character witnesses and conspiracy theories with a huge grain of salt. Like a motherfucking mountain of salt. All right? Angus Young has said, and this has been backed up by Malcolm in past quotes, they were in London, they started to rehearse, they had some songs, they had some riffs. Malcolm came up the Back in Black riff while they were on tour for Highway to Hell. They had just wrapped up a leg of the Highway to Hell tour, and they were in London with the purpose of rehearsing the songs for their next album. It wouldn't have been called Back in Black if Bon lived, I'll tell you that, and more in that song, which is another flaw in Jesse Fink's book. Bon did show up at one of these sessions. They were working on the Hell's Bells intro. They said just the intro at that point. They had most of the music for Have a Drink on Me and Let Me Put My Love Into You finished, and Bon played drums, because Bon used to be a drummer back in the day, kind of like Steven Tyler. He was a drummer before he became a singer, and Bon jammed with the band, and they worked on those songs, and then Bon was going to go off and was going to start writing. His mother did confirm this, that Bon Scott had begun writing Malcolm, and Angus have also said in repeated interviews that Bon had started writing songs for Back in Black, but they ultimately didn't use what he wrote. Now, this was just after working on a couple songs, 2 or 3 songs, and Bon had just, started writing down some stuff. And that was pretty much it. Because then Bon Scott, unfortunately, died. Shortly after that initial rehearsal, just a couple nights later, and this is the thing, Silver Smith says, this is one of her quotes from the book. I'm going to read this, because this is another thing that's bullshit from Jesse Fink's book. I've never sat down and listened to Back in Black. Okay, so you never listened to Back in Black. Okay, so you're the fucking expert. So I never sat and listened to Back in Black, but that night, the night Bon died, that was why he wanted to go out. He'd finished. All right. I'd been around for the writing of a few albums by then, so he knew that I knew what his pattern was. He would write away from the band. Okay, first and foremost, the band hated Silver, they would never let her into their inner circle. So she wouldn't have known the process of what Bon did with the band. Yes, Bon sometimes did write some stuff in his notebook away from the band, but not the majority. The majority of lyrics normally Bon would write in the studio with the band. The band would normally, and I'll talk more about this later, they would already have the title of the song or the chorus, which usually was the title of the song, already. Angus and Malcolm would come up with the title, and they would have all the music written. And then they would give it to Bon and say, hey, this is the title, this is the chorus, write some verses. And Bon would literally sometimes just go into another room in the studio. This is what made him such a genius. He would jot down and come up with these amazing verses and knock them out. And this often happened in the studio. This is how they were writing songs since the first High Voltage album. So right there, Silversmith's insight into the writing process of Bon Scott and AC/DC is inaccurate. And not to mention, Bon Scott was a notorious alcoholic that loved to go out and drink all the time and party whenever he could. So the fact that he wanted to go out and party and drink by no means meant he was finished. Plus, the band didn't work that way. Nothing was finished. They were still working out lyrics in the studio, usually, even after the rehearsal stage. They would be working with a producer, especially Mutt Lange. Mutt Lange reshaped almost half the songs that were already rehearsed on Highway to Hell. You can hear on the Bonfire box set, there are those earlier versions of the Highway to Hell songs where all the lyrics are different, the melodies are different. Before Mutt Lange got his hands on them, they reworked all those songs. So nothing was close to finished at this stage. Silversmith was talking a lot of bullshit. Not to mention, this is another thing. I don't want to be bad-mouthing a deceased woman. But let me tell you something people should know, all right? This is the woman that literally, she is partially responsible for Bon Scott's death. Bon Scott wanted to hang out with her that night. That's a phone call that she receives from Bon Scott saying, hey, come out. I want to go hit this club in London, go to a rock show, have fun. He wanted to see her. He missed her. And Silver blew him off. Didn't feel like going out. So she sent one of her friends, this guy named Alistair, this poor guy named Alistair, gets sent out to essentially kind of hang out with Bon because Silver didn't want to be bothered with him that night. So Alistair, who's this young guy, goes around with Bon. They do a lot of drinking. Things get a little out of control. Bon keeps drinking and drinking. Bon passes out in the backseat of his car. Alistair then calls Silver and says, hey, Bon Scott's passed out in the backseat of my car. What should I do? According to him, Silver said, leave him there. He does it all the time. He'll sleep it off. Okay, so this is the woman that told the guy that had Bon Scott passed out in the back of his car, don't move him, don't try to wake him up, don't try to carry him into your house. No, just let him sleep it off. You're really going to take the word of a junkie woman that advised the guy to let Bon Scott sleep in the back of his car as the character witness over people like Malcolm Young, the great Malcolm Young, who was there in the trenches with Bon Scott, who wrote all those amazing songs with Bon Scott, who called Bon Scott's parents and broke the news of Bon Scott's death to them. Did Silver do that? No. Malcolm Young did that. You're going to take Silversmith's words over Malcolm Young and all these other hanger-oners that the band rightfully shook off. Brian came out recently with this book, yes, which I read. Brian Johnson, The Lives of Brian. Brian addresses, he doesn't directly reference Jesse Fink's book, but he indirectly references, and he talks about the conspiracy theory that he didn't write the lyrics. And as a result, he goes into a lot of detail about the lyric writing process of Back in Black, a lot of which he had cited at various times and at various interviews in the past, and most of which ring true, and I'm sure they are true. I believe Brian Johnson wrote the majority of Back in Black. A lot of these people in the Jesse Fink book say things like, oh, Bon wrote the whole album. It's all him. And again, no disrespect to Bon Scott. He's one of my favorite singers and I think a genius lyricist. But Bon Scott never wrote a whole AC/DC album ever because he didn't write music. Yeah, he didn't write music. He said it himself in Let There Be Rock, the Let There Be Rock movie. He says, I wouldn't know anything about writing music. He's a lyricist. He's a singer and lyricist. So it's really disrespectful to Angus and Malcolm Young, who write all this amazing music, and Phil Rudd, who comes up with these amazing drum lines, and the great production work of George Young and Harry Vonda and Mutt Lange. like to act like it was just all Bon Scott. Okay, Bon Scott was great. It was a very important part of AC/DC. Now, obviously, the band was able to continue without him. So it proved to be not entirely essential. He was essential in the early days, though, when they were defining themselves and creating the blueprint of what AC/DC was. But even with Bon Scott, the Young brothers usually came up with the song title. This was already a songwriting approach that they had before Bon joined the band. Bon was not AC/DC's first singer. Their first singer was this guy named Dave Evans, who was not that good of a singer. So they gave him the boot and replaced him with a great singer, Bon Scott. But the first single was with Dave Evans, and it's Can I Sit Next to You, Girl? Now, Bon would come in later and revise the verses and sing it again on the International High Voltage album, TNT in Australia. But the chorus, the title of the song, came from the Young brothers, and that's a big hook in the song. And that's the thing. The Young brothers had very good instincts for choruses and hooks, and that's a big part of AC/DC. They got that because their older brother was George Young, who was already a songwriter and performer in the Australian band, the Easy Beats. Angus and Malcolm were the younger brothers, and George Young was a mentor to them. He wasn't just a producer, he was a songwriting mentor to them who would sit down with them and show them how to write songs. In fact, in the early days, AC/DC songs were first written on guitar, but then George Young would do a test where they had to play them also on the piano to see if it was still a good song, even on piano. That was like the test. So that just shows you that even before Brian Johnson joined the band, the Young brothers had already had a hand in the lyric writing and the songwriting, and Bon was primarily providing lyrics for the verses. So that's why it's not so crazy when Brian stepped in and suddenly had to write lyrics for Back in Black. Like, a lot of people think, like, they cite the timeline. They just go, oh, well, there's no way that in 6 weeks they could put this all together, something like this. Well, it wasn't really just 6 weeks. Now, this is where I'm going to read you the timeline here to what happened. In February 1980, February 15, 1980, Scott, according to Angus and Malcolm, he attended rehearsal sessions, not recording sessions, rehearsal sessions for a couple Back in Black songs, Have a Drink on Me, and Let Me Put My Love Into You. Although they said Bon was primarily acting as a drummer on the sessions and then was going off to write the lyrics. Now, does this mean that Bon didn't throw out a few lines when he was there? We don't know. Then a couple nights later is when Bon tragically dies, February 19th, 1980. The following month, the end of the following month, March 29, is when Johnson is offered a job after his famous audition. One thing interestingly, that he reveals in The Lives of Brian is that there was 2 auditions. I only knew about the first one. On the second audition, they played him Back in Black, the music for Back in Black, he says, and the band had the title. Malcolm said, this song's called Back in Black, and it's going to be a tribute to Bon. We don't have verses yet. We want it to be a tribute to him, but we don't want it to be morbid. All right, and that always lined up with things Malcolm and Angus had said about what their intention was for Back in Black, how they wanted it to be a tribute to Bon Scott, but not maudlin. Still, embrace the spirit of the band and rock and roll, which is what Bon Scott would have wanted. So yeah, they had Back in Black. They told him this is the song. Brian said he came up with the first 2 lines, Back in Black, I hit the sack. That's it. But the band liked it, and that helped him get the job, actually. And to me, that all seems very feasible and has a ring of truth. April, things are moving fast. Okay, keep in mind, this is how the machinery of the AC/DC operation was working at this point. They did an album a year, but they were knocking out pretty much an album a year. This is how bands did it back then. Look at all the stuff Kiss released in the late 70s. They did 2 albums a year. It's a different time back then, all right? People knocked shit out fast. The Beatles in the mid-60s were doing 2 albums a year. Look at the songs they were writing. They were writing stuff like Revolver and Rubber Soul in a matter of weeks. So why do you think it's so unusual that AC/DC, at the top of their fucking game, with a professional singer that had been singing in bands for 10 years, along with one of the greatest producers of all time, who was also a co-songwriter for a lot of Def Leppard's big hits, why do you think it's so unusual that they could knock out in a span of 2 months an amazing album like Back in Black? And especially add to it that they're inspired by this emotional thing that they're going through. Times like this is when when people really tap into the muses and create great art. To me, none of this is unusual. I mean, the Led Zeppelin did their first 2 albums in 1 year. Black Sabbath did their first 2 albums in 1 year between touring. That's how people really did it back then, all right? So now people are recontextualizing. To them, this seems absurd that they could do this so fast. Wasn't absurd by 1980 standards, especially not by 1980 AC/DC standards. And like I said, even without Bon, they were a fucking tight unit. Angus and Malcolm, the dream team of guitar riff making, who also were great at coming up with choruses and song titles and hooks and all that stuff. Mutt Lange producing them, the producer of Highway to Hell. And you got fucking Phil Rudd and Cliff Williams, the rhythm section. And then you got Brian Johnson, who, like I said, sang in Geordie. He was singing professionally for 10 years. He performed at Top of the Pops. Even though he wrote only a few songs in Geordie and they were nothing special, he still was around songwriters. He had been in recording studios. It's like an actor that's been on film sets that then one day can suddenly become a director. Like, he knew what the songwriting process was. Plus, he had the Young Brothers guiding him. He had Mutt Lange guiding him. And he had Bon Scott guiding him. You don't think he wasn't listening to Highway to Hell? Of course, that would have been his homework assignment. In fact, one of the songs they told him to sing for his second edition was Highway to Hell. And of course, he's following the pattern established by Bon Scott on Highway to Hell. He's going to write lyrics and melodies that are similar to the lyrics and melodies that are in Highway to Hell, because that's his fucking job. He's a professional singer who's been given this opportunity, the opportunity of a lifetime, and he's going to step up to the plate and do the best work he's ever done. So by the end of March, they were already working on the songs a little bit. They had already thrown Back at Black at Brian. And then throughout April and May, they go to Bahamas and they record Back in Black. They had most of the music written, and they'd had a few lyrics written, and the Young Brothers had most of the choruses and song titles. So to me, it's not that unusual or suspicious that Brian would be able to come up with a lot of great verses to go along with all this, especially with the Young Brothers involved in the songwriting process, and Mutt Lange. Mutt Lange, actually, according to Brian Johnson, he details, and it's really specific detail about the writing of Hell's Bells and a story he's told before about the thunder and the storm that hit the Bahamas that inspired the lyrics. But he talks about how Mutt Lange is essentially like pulling out of him the lyrics. He's like, oh, and what now, Brian? And what are you hearing now? Is that wind? Is that like a hurricane? Mutt Lange's acting like a director getting a performance out of an actor. Also, Brian Johnson has said in various interviews that You Shook Me All Night Long. Again, they already had the chorus. They already knew the song title. They wanted him to go off and write the verses like Bon Scott often did. And some of those lines do sound like Brian Johnson lines, in my opinion. I mean, she's a fast machine. She keeps her motor clean. That's kind of like something a gearhead guy who loves cars might write. The melody's definitely very Bon Scott. And of course, there's the line. This is a line that gets discussed a lot because there's some British journalist that claims to have seen this line in one of Bon Scott's notebooks. He says it, but he doesn't have proof. He didn't take a picture. She told me to come, but I was already there. That does sound very Bon Scott, I admit. In fact, I think the melody throughout the verses sound very Bon Scott, more Bon Scott than Brian. Although, Let's Get It Up to Me is pretty similar lyrically and melodically, and that's on the next album. So there you go. And that was a big hit at the time too. But, now it's a little forgotten, so poser casual fans don't talk about that conveniently. And we'll talk a lot about For Those About to Rock at the end of this. And according to Brian in that book, and this is something that has been cited in past interviews as well, rock and roll ain't noise pollution. That title, that phrase came from Bon Scott. They've always admitted that. And once again, Brian admits it in the book. He says that the lads, Malcolm and Angus, told him that was something that Bon Scott had actually said to like some landlord or landlady that was like busting his balls over blasting music. And Bon screamed, rock and roll ain't noise pollution. So he's citing that Bon Scott came up with that phrase. And that's the thing too. So Bon Scott is a major influence on Back in Black. I mean, this is another thing. People are not really recognizing the power of influence. It's like George Harrison's All Things Must Pass. Like, that's so much stronger than his later albums. Even by the time you get to the mid-70s, you're like, well, what happened? Why isn't George Harrison writing things like All Things Must Pass anymore? He's no longer having that afterglow of working with Lennon McCartney. Yeah, there's the Lennon McCartney afterglow. All their early solo albums, the Beatles have a Beatles afterglow that slowly but surely fades as we get deeper and deeper into the 70s. Why would this be any different? Bon Scott was a major influence on the band. He was someone that helped shape their sound. And by the time they got to Highway to Hell, like Bon helped the band really get down what they were about. and what kind of songs they were going to write. So, of course, Bon would still have a major influence, and especially if they had even started working on the album a little bit right before he died. And again, the band has always said that. They have always said that this is a tribute to Bon Scott. Brian has always said it. Brian has always talked about the feeling that Bon Scott's spirit was there and helped him, guide him, and all that. Maybe that's a little bit of guilt because deep down he suspects that maybe a line or two that the young brother threw his way might have came from Bon. Or maybe he's just honoring the guy because he recognized his influence and because, he studied his lyric writing. That was his homework assignment. He even says every time he wrote a line, he was thinking, what would Bon write? Like, how would Bon write You Shook Me All Night Long? Well, not surprised that it sounds kind of like a Bon Scott song because he's thinking in his head, I'm trying to write a Bon Scott song. Let's talk about Back in Black now. Now, this is one of the biggest things I have an issue with Jesse Fink's book, is he tries to sell this idea, because Back in Black is obviously a song written after Bon's death because it's called Back in Black. It's about how the band's gonna persevere after his death. He tries to sell this idea, and this is the shakiest of all these lyric theories, that it's actually meant to be Bon Scott's original vision was back in the black, and it was about his bank account, about how suddenly he wasn't in the red anymore because of the success of Highway to Hell. They were back in the black. Like, this is the success story after Down Payment Blues. Bullshit. After Highway to Hell, that was the first time he ever had major money ever in his life, like big time money. So I don't know, Bon Scott probably never was in the black to begin with. So you would have to have been in the black to be back in the black. Bon Scott wrote about money, but he didn't use banking terms. Like, that's just not how Bon wrote. I can't even imagine him writing a lyric saying, I'm in the black. It just doesn't sound like Bon Scott. And obviously, these lyrics have nothing to do with bank accounts. And they have everything to do about persevering after death. Back in Black by Young, and Johnson. Back in Black, I hit the sack. I've been too long. I'm glad to be back. Yes, I'm let loose from the noose. Let loose from the noose. Death imagery. You got that? That's kept me hanging about. I've been looking at the sky because it's getting me high. Forget the hearse because I never die. Okay, talking about a hearse. They're never gonna die. You get it? I got 9 lives. All right, you get it? They're going to continue after a death. Cat's eyes, abusing every one of them and running wild. Because I'm back in black. They got to catch me if they want me to hang. Because I'm back on the track. Obviously, these lyrics, which are amazing lyrics, are about overcoming death, overcoming Bon Scott's death. I think Have a Drink on Me is the tribute to Bon Scott. I think Back in Black is about them, the band, continuing afterwards. And yes, Angus and Malcolm decided that this song was going to be called Back in Black. They decided this song is going to be, because it's such a fucking choice riff, is going to be the title track, and that's what this album's going to be. It's going to be a tribute to Bon. And they give Brian the task of writing the verses. And they say, this song's about overcoming death. Makes sense. That's what this song's about. Obviously, not about bank accounts. And that's the thing. Jesse Fink, you're telling me you really think this song's about a bank account? It's a fucking joke. All right. Something that conveniently Jesse Fink and all his has-beens and hanger-oners and shady people that he gets quotes from, they don't actually listen to the melody structure. Like, the thing too, You Shook Me All Night Long sounds a lot like a Bon Scott melody, but Back in Black doesn't. Brian puts in, and this is something you'll hear in a lot of songs in Back in Black, if you compare the verses and the melodies from Highway to Hell to Back in Black, and then For Those About to Rock We Salute You, there's no question that Back in Black is closer. I'm not even talking in terms of production and singing and the riffs and the sound. I'm talking in terms of the lyric writing and the choices of words and how many words are used in a verse. Back in Black is much closer to the style of For Those About to Rock, because Brian sings a little differently than Bon. He sings faster. He can get more words into a sentence. And as a result, he has more rhymes. Like Bon would have like 2 words he'd rhyme, where Brian like kind of squeezes in 3 at times. It's almost like rapping. He talks about this in his book. Like, this was kind of like rap almost. He has this jazzy, bluesier thing where he gets in a lot of words in kind of a jivey way. And you'll hear that in a lot of the songs throughout Back in Black. Yeah, Bon Scott just wouldn't even sing it that way. That's why that AI of him singing Back in Black sounds like shit, because it's not really how he would sing. You notice You Shook Me All Night Long does sound a little bit better. I don't think it sounds as good as people act like it does, but it's a little bit better because, that melody sounds a little more Bon Scott-esque. But again, it's not like it's impossible for a guy who was singing professionally for 10 years, working with the songwriting guitarist duo that worked with the guy, Bon Scott, and working with one of the greatest producers who had produced Highway to Hell. It's not unfathomable that they could figure out how to do a Bon Scott-esque melody. And the funny thing, too, is these people in Jesse Fink's books, they always just go for the hits. You notice that? Like, you have to make it Back in Black and Hell's Bells and You Shook Me All Night Long because they want it to be the hits because they're casual fans. They don't even listen to Back in Black. You know, it's funny because like one of the songs that to me is one of the most Bon Scott-esque songs they never talk about, and it was even one of the ones he was working on before he died. Let Me Put My Love Into You. Let Me Put My Love Into You rivals You Shook Me All Night Long for the most Bon Scott-esque song on the album, in my opinion. It's more melodic in the verses, a little less scat-like. It's kind of sensual in a way that Bon Scott was sensual. It sounds like a better version of like Love Hungry Man. Even for those about to rock, we salute you, I feel like some of the songs like Let's Get It Up sound a little like You Shook Me All Night Long. But there's really nothing that sounds like Let Me Put My Love Into You. Like that, you know, maybe it's just because the changing time, like there's a slight late 70s hangover. But to me, that sounds a little like a Bon Scott song. And the fact that it was one of the songs he was jamming with them on the drums, it's interesting that they never bring up that song because it wasn't one of the hits. Yeah, one of these mysterious ex-girlfriends don't want to brag about how they think Let Me Put My Love Into You was written about her. It's really dirty. It's a dirty song, and it wasn't a hit. So they rather go to the slightly less dirty, big popular hit. Now I'm going to talk about the Kerrang quote. I would think this was almost all bullshit if it wasn't for the fact, and this is one thing that Jesse Fink, of course, brings up a lot, and like I said, it was out there on the internet even before he dug it up, so it wasn't some amazing journalism that he was able to find this thing that I'd already known about from reading a few message boards. But yes, in the 1991 Paul Elliott interview with Angus Young for Kerrang, this is like Razor's Edge period, he did an interview of Kerrang. Elliott came right out and said, who wrote the lyrics on Giving the Dog a Bone and the others on Back in Black? Bon or Brian or both? Angus Young responded, Bon wrote a little of the stuff. There you go. Angus actually said Bon wrote a little of the stuff. He then proceeded to tell the story he's told many times about how they were jamming on a couple of those songs, and Bon went off to write the lyrics, and then he didn't finish them, and then they finished Back in Black. And this was like before the age of the internet, and obviously decades before Jesse Fink's book, so the journalists didn't follow it up. You know, nowadays, if Angus said that, they would probably follow it up, saying, oh, go back a bit. Let's go back to when you said Bon wrote a little of the stuff. Care to elaborate? Reporter didn't even bother to do that. He just lost it. He didn't realize what Angus had handed him, and they never come back to it, unfortunately, because yeah, I'd be very interested to know what's Angus Young's definition of wrote a little of the stuff. So there you go. So obviously Bon wrote a little of the stuff. Now, I think we should take that literally and assume when Angus Young said Bon wrote a little of the stuff, he meant a little of the stuff. As in, not much. A line here and there, maybe a title here and there. Hell, it could even be the one title they've always cited and gave credit to Bon Scott in interviews, Rock and Rolling Noise Pollution. Maybe that's all he means by a little stuff. And that would make sense, and that would also explain why they didn't think they needed to give him songwriting credit. Most likely, it probably is a little bit more than that. It's probably like a few lines here and there. Maybe, she told me to come and I was already there. Maybe Have a Drink on Me. And that was one of the songs that he was jamming out with them. And it's called Have a Drink on Me. And that feels very Bon Scott. And Rock and Roll Ain't Noise Pollution, at least that title, the title of that song. And that's probably about it. And that would fall under a little stuff to me. So that's probably it. Brian, I don't think Brian's lying when he doesn't talk about this or that there was a few lines from Bon, because I'm sure the band wouldn't have told him that. They still treat Brian this way. They still treat him like he's a hired gun with the band. Could you only imagine how they treated him in 1980? Do you really think if they were using one or two lines from Bon Scott that, short of maybe the title Rock and Roll Ain't Noise Pollution, do you really think they were going to say, oh, by the way, this was Bon writing it, and give Brian a complex? I don't know. I don't think they would have even bothered to tell him that. They probably just said, here's some lyrics we already got. That's it. One or two good lines here and there as a little tribute to Bon, but not enough that they felt it really justified a songwriting credit. There is another another quote, seemingly a little more damning even, and is another check in the Bon Scott conspiracy column that Jesse Fink cites. It's a 1998 interview with Elisa Blake from the Australian Rolling Stone. Blake asks Angus Young, have you ever thought about quitting? Angus Young said, the only time was when Bon died. We were in doubt about what to do, but we had songs that he had written and wanted to finish the songs. We thought it would be our tribute to Bon, and that album became Back in Black. Now, that sounds like it's a little more than a little bit of stuff. He says, quote unquote, that he had written. We had songs that he had written. This is the thing. I cannot find this Rolling Stone interview anywhere on the internet. I combed the whole internet, and I'm a good Google searcher, and I cannot find it. If anyone has a link to a PDF file of this interview, I'd like to see it. Post it in the comments. I'm not saying Jesse Fink's lying. I'm just saying I haven't seen this. It's not on the internet. You see, the other thing, Kerrang, it's out there. It's out on the internet. I showed you the picture. I can't show you the picture of this one because it's not out there. You know, the thing that's odd about this quote, it seems odd that even if Bon Scott wrote all the verses to Back in Black, which was primarily what he wrote, it feels odd that Angus would use the phrase songs that he had written. Even with wanting to honor Bon, I don't feel like he would have given him that much credit because it's not the songwriting process of AC/DC. Angus and Malcolm wrote all the music, and that's part of the song. The song's not just the lyrics. So I feel like Angus wouldn't have said it that way. It just seems like a weird way to phrase it. So I don't know. It's a little suspicious. If he really did say it, maybe it is a little more than a little bit of stuff. I still think even in that regard, it's taken out of context. I think he might be saying that he had gone off, he had started writing songs, we had finished the songs, and then they rewrote them with new lyrics. I mean, who knows? I don't know. I want to see proof. I want to see evidence of that quote. So if you got the evidence, hey, Jesse Fink, if you're watching this video, post me a link or email me a link. I want to see it. I need to see this evidence, all right? And even then, it's still debatable. I'm still going to take Malcolm Young's words. I'm going to take half of Angus Young's words. And I'm going to take Brian Johnson's words still over a lot of other people. These people that are kind of part of the conspiracy are kind of missing the point and the poignancy of Back in Black. Like, you're almost dishonoring Bon Scott in a twisted way because you're taking away the fact that it is a tribute to him. The whole album, it's in black. It's obvious that it's a tribute to Bon Scott and the way he lived. And songs like Have a Drink with Me, some people think, oh, it's crass. Why would they write a song like that when he's drunk himself to death? Because these were hard blokes, Malcolm Young himself was a hard drinker. They knew that that's how Bon lived. It's like, you live by the sword, you die by the sword kind of tough, hard knock stuff. They knew that Bon Scott, that's who he was. That's how he liked to live. He was a rock and roller, So I feel like people just are like soft people that don't really get that mentality. It's like an Irish wake. And of course, the bells in the beginning, Hell's Bells, the funeral. It's a funeral tolls. And also Rock and Roll Ain't Noise Pollution. Ending the album with a song title that comes directly from Bon Scott. Obviously, this is a amazing album recognizing Bon Scott's influence and impact on the band. They created arguably the greatest rock and roll album of all time. It's the second biggest selling album of all time, biggest selling rock album of all time. Thriller ain't a rock album, so it's the biggest selling rock album of all time. And even though personally Powerage and For Those About to Rock We Salute You are my top two favorite AC/DC albums, Back in Black, very close third favorite, and objectively the greatest rock record of all time. Definitely the greatest produced rock record of all time. And the poignancy, like I said, if you remove the poignancy of a band honoring their fallen singer, which is what a lot of these conspiracy theorists do, they're really removing the heart of this amazing album, this amazing tribute to this man that these people were friends and worked with. And Brian Johnson was a man that Bon Scott was a fan of. His band, the Fraternity, they were the Fraternity and then they became Fang. Essentially, they were like a hippie prog rock band. They opened up for Geordie, Brian Johnson's band, in the early 70s. Bon would go on and talk about Brian Johnson to the Young brothers and also to his parents about Brian Johnson, how he thought he was an amazing singer. He saw him playing one night when Brian Johnson had an appendix attack and started screaming, and Bon didn't realize it was part of the show. Another thing is Brian Johnson, in the early days of Geordie, he would put the guitarist on his shoulder. There's actual photographic proof of that. See that, Jesse Fink? Look, photographic proof. So in the early 70s, Brian Johnson, and this again, no disrespect to Bon Scott, But while Bon Scott was still in a hippie band, that played flutes and stuff and sounded nothing like AC/DC, Brian Johnson was like in this boogie woogie rock and roll band that sometimes had some hard rockin' songs that sounded a little like proto AC/DC. Geordie definitely sounded more like AC/DC than the Fraternity and Fang. Just saying. And look, Brian Johnson's actually doing what would become a classic stage move that Bon Scott obviously was inspired by. He was inspired by that and put Angus on his shoulders because at the time, Geordie was a bigger band than his band. They were an English band and they were on top of the pops. So obviously he would have been taking a few notes, taking a few cues. And also Brian Johnson loved to belt it out. He was a screamer and he loved Little Richard, and that was Bon Scott's favorite singer. So they both loved Little Richard. Brian Johnson was also a working class lad. Like Bon Scott, when he joined AC/DC, both these guys were in their 30s. They had already had bands that in the past almost made it. Brian's band got a little further than Bon's, but neither of them really made them a big international act, and they eventually had to go back to working class jobs. Like, they actually had to go back to working class jobs after thinking they were going to be big rock stars. And that's why it's very poetic, and that's why, like, only Brian could do it. Brian's the only guy, in my opinion, literally the only person that could have filled Bon's shoes because of that reason alone, is that Brian was the only guy that had that working class edge like Bon, that knew what it was like, who was both a professional singer that was really skilled at what he did, but yet wasn't above going back and putting in a hard day's work. Brian was working, putting in windscreens on cars. Eventually, he was so good at that he had his own little garage and his own little company, and he was making some decent money at it. Not rock star money, not Back in Black money, but he had made a good life for himself. And he was playing in a band called Geordie too, and they were essentially a pub band going around they did for fun, and they would do Whole Lotta Rosie, which is one of the songs he sang with the band for his famous audition. And he thought Whole Lotta Rosie was one of the greatest rock and roll songs he had ever heard. Bon Scott would have loved what Brian Johnson did. He would have loved his singing. He would have loved his lyrics. He would have loved what he did. I think Bon would have absolutely have loved Back in Black, For Those About to Rock, and Flick of the Switch. And I think he would have loved a lot of later stuff too. You tell me you don't think Bon Scott wouldn't have loved Big Gun? Of course, Bon would have loved that shit. Ball Breaker, bluesy, dark, sleazy Ball Breaker. He would have loved all that stuff. And now I want to talk about For Those About to Rock, We Salute You. You're telling me the lyrics of Back in Black and the songwriting of Back in Black doesn't sound very similar to For Those About to Rock, We Salute You. There's this idea, this myth that's put forth by modern day music journalists and casual fans, I say casual fans, this idea that For Those About to Rock, We Salute You is like some big drop off in quality. Hardcore AC/DC fans do not accept that. I know many people who think For Those About to Rock, We Salute You is even better than Back in Black. I'm one of them. I was on a podcast with the great Ralph Viera, who, even though he does not share that view, he thinks Back in Black is better than For Those About to Rock, We Salute You, but he still loves For Those About to Rock. He still thinks it's a great album. Me and the drummer from Death Angel, Will Carroll, debated that issue with him on this podcast, and I'm going to leave a link down below. I have a YouTube link to that podcast, and you'll hear me and Will Carroll debating For Those About to Rock, We Salute You. So you got two guys, 2 against 1. Now, the one is Ralph Viera, so it's possible that me and Will Carroll were wrong. I also did a podcast, my own podcast, with my rock and roll brother, Eric Jordan, RMCP. We did a review of For Those About to Rock, We Salute You with my actor/singer friend, Michael Hampton. All three of us think For Those About to Rock, We Salute You is the best album with Brian Johnson and edges out Back in Black. The great Ian Wadley, I believe, thinks that too. I know a lot of people that think that. So what? We all wrong? We all drinking the Kool-Aid? Listen, no album in the history of the world has sounded more like Back in Black than For Those About to Rock, We Salute You. I can get you think Back in Black's a little better. I get that you might prefer it to For Those About to Rock, but to act like For Those About to Rock is like some shitty album that's like a poor follow-up, to me, bullshit. I don't really think you're even listening to the album. You don't hear the darkness and richness of that album. Now, I don't normally like to cite Rolling Stone, but this was one of the few guys in Rolling Stone in the 80s that didn't have his head up his ass. Kurt Loder. Always liked Kurt Loder. People might remember him from MTV News. He always seemed like a smart, straight shooter. He gave a review for Those About to Rock, We Salute You when he came out, and he said it was the best AC/DC album yet. There you go. And it was a #1 album, their first #1 in America. The radio was playing Let's Get It Up a lot. And of course, the title track is a classic that ends all their concerts to this day. But the whole album is great, filled with great songs. You're going to tell me that same person that wrote the lyrics to Evil Walks isn't the same that wrote Hell's Bells? You're going to tell me that Let's Get It Up is so much different than You Shook Me All Night Long? Giving the Dog a Bone, Inject the Venom. Are they so different? Look at the lyrics. Look at the word choices. Listen to how Brian phrases things. Let's swap out COD. All right, let's take the song COD, masterful song, COD. Put that on Highway to Hell with Bond singing, all right? And now let's put Love Hungry Man on For Those About to Rock Resalute You. You know what would happen? All these Bon Scott conspiracy people would be using Love Hungry Man as an example of dumb lyrics. Yeah, they would go, look at those lyrics. Bond's weakest lyrics on that album, admittedly. Everything else is great. Look at the lyrics of COD. If these lyrics were on a Bon Scott album, you'd all be using them as an example of cleverness in all the ingenious wordplay that Bond did. These lyrics all play off the abbreviation COD in interesting, unexpected ways. Let me read these lyrics. COD, call of a dog, cry of a bitch, cream of a dream is the cause of the itch, call of the doctor, cash on demand, if you get enough rope, might even hang. Kind of similar to the rhythmic structure of Back in Black. COD, care of the devil. COD, the devil and me. COD, care of the devil and me. The curse of love is the cause of the pain. The crime of the day is where you do it again. Call of the doctor, cash on demand. If you give them a finger, they'll take off your hand. COD, care of the devil. COD, the devil and me, etc., etc. Not doing the obvious thing where the song's called Cash on Demand, but making it care of the devil and then twisting these phrases around. That's a great sample of wordplay. Wordplay from an album that these conspiracy theorists don't say Bon Scott wrote. Few people. There's a few people that say For Those About to Rock and Flick of the Switch are written by Bon as well. They had this big notebook, so they had like 3 albums worth of material. Not how Bon Scott wrote. He only wrote when they gave him riffs, so it's unfeasible. And it's convenient. It's convenient that they just want to give the 3 albums they consider to be the best Brian Johnson era albums to Bon Scott. Even a few years later, let's go to Who Made Who. Brian Johnson and the boys are given the task to write a song for the Maximum Overdrive movie. Do they call it just Maximum Overdrive, even though that sounds like it could be an AC/DC song? Do they write a song about trucks fucking things up and driving up the highway and running down people and making a bunch of dick references? Do they do that? No, instead, they write a very clever philosophical song based on one line from the movie that they latched onto, and make it about this Faustian pact of machinery, and then the machines one day are controlling you. Oh, does that sound familiar? Does that sound like the life we live now? But the video game says play me. Face it on a level, but it takes you every time on a one-on-one. Feeling running down your spine. Nothing gonna save you one last dime, cause it own you. The data bank know my number. Says I gotta pay cause I made the grade last year. These are fucking great lyrics. My favorite lyrics that Brian Johnson ever wrote is actually on Blow Up Your Video. Great lyrics on that one. The last album to feature his lyrics. The song called Some Sin for Nothing. Some sin for gold. Some sin for shame. Some sin for cash. Some sin for gain. Some sin for wine. Some sin for pain. But I ain't gonna be the fool who's gonna have to sin for nothing. Come on. You're telling me that's not Bon Scott level lyrics? I'm not saying Brian, for the most part, was as consistently clever as Bon Scott, but he had his moments. The way he's actually using sin and turning a word that's normally used as a noun and using it as a verb, and kind of similar to what he does on COD and Back in Black, using these different words to kind of create this jivey stream of consciousness rap, is evidence of a really good songwriter. Not just a lyricist, but a good songwriter. I think there was a drop-off when the Young brothers squeezed him out of writing lyrics. Another thing that sometimes the Bon Scott conspiracy theorists throw in as evidence. After Blow Up Your Video, the Young brothers took over lyric writing duties. Like after the whole facade was done, they wanted to be the ones to get the credit because they were maybe they were doing it all along. They really wrote all the lyrics to Back in Black, or they were coasting on Bond's lyrics and kind of gave Brian a shot, but they didn't think he was really up to snuff. I don't believe that's the case. For one thing, Blow Up Your Video, at the time it came out, like now it's considered one of the weaker albums, but at the time it was considered both a critical and commercial comeback. It made more money than Fly on the Wall and Flick of the Switch, and some critics, even Rolling Stone yet again, gave it a positive review, and a lot of people cited the songwriting as stronger than it was in the last couple albums. So this idea that, oh yeah, they had enough of Brian's shitty lyrics, no, he was taking them up a notch with Who Made Who and Blow Up Your Video. And I don't think it's any evidence that Bon Scott wrote Back in Black either. I think it's evidence that, yes, the Young brothers do like money. They do like money. Doesn't mean they're bad people, but they knew what the Razor's Edge was going to be. At the very least, they had a sneaking suspicion. Blow Up Your Video was setting up the real big comeback. Aerosmith had major success. They had their comeback. Everyone was kind of going back to the roots. Guns N' Roses were bringing that kind of music, that more rootsy 70s style hard rock, back into the hard rock marketplace. People wanted that kind of music again. The writing was on the wall that AC/DC could have a big comeback if they played it right. They had enlisted Bruce Fairbairn, who had produced Bon Jovi and Aerosmith, Pump and Permitification. So he was the producer that was helping Aerosmith with their commercial comeback. They knew that there was a chance that this next album might be the biggest album since For Those About to Rock, We Salute You. As far as we know, the way the Young brothers wrote, they probably already had some of the riffs. They probably already had some of Thunderstruck and Money Talks. They probably already had some song titles and choruses because that's what they did. Surely there was a secret Young family meeting where they were thinking about all the royalties, all the songwriting royalties that they had to always give Brian Johnson after the success of Back in Black. You see, that's the thing. When Back in Black, when they were working on it and writing it, they were still innocent. They still didn't know how much money they were going to make. They had just started making big money with Highway to Hell, and they didn't realize just how big Back in Black was going to be. So I don't think they really realized how much money they'd be handing over to Brian Johnson because of Back in Black and For Those About to Rock, which was also a big hit. So I'm sure they had a family meeting. It's like, we're giving Brian Johnson a big share of these publishing rights and the songwriting royalties. We're coming up for all the music. We're coming up with the choruses and the song titles. And gee, maybe we should just take the time and just write these verses ourselves. Like, hey, we can make up some double entendres. We could do that and we'll get all the money. Yeah. So you know what? We don't want Razor's Edge and Thunderstruck and Money Talks and all these songs that we think might be big hits on MTV and on the radio. Yeah, we don't want to give Brian the money anymore. He's paid well as a singer, but let's keep the songwriting credits for the family. And so they squeezed them out. Brian even said it was a management decision. And you know what? I notice a difference. I still think the lyrics are decent with the Young brothers, but in the same way you can see a little bit of a drop-off after Bond, you can see, I think, an even bigger drop-off after Brian. Really read the lyrics to Blow Up Your Video, and then read the lyrics to The Razor's Edge. You're telling me that's not an even bigger drop-off? That's a much bigger drop-off than Back in Black after Highway to Hell, or even if we removed Back in Black for argument's sake, let's say For Those About to Rock after Highway to Hell. They're closer in quality, lyrically, than Razor's Edge and Blow Up Your Video, in my opinion. If anything, I think that's evidence that Brian Johnson was writing, because there was a drop-off. And even though they had their moments, they brought back a little of the darkness and grit with Ball Breaker. There was one thing about the Young brothers' lyrics that I don't think they have, something that both Bon and Brian brought to the lyrics when they were writing them, is a working class edge. They just don't have this working class edge. And like I pointed out, Brian has a real cool kind of almost like hip hop lyrical flow. There's a grittiness. There's a grittiness to Brian's lyrics that are missing from the band from The Razor's Edge on. The lyrics are a little more generic and a little less tough sounding, and they sound like they come a little less from life experience. So all these people that want to just throw stones and make shots at Brian Johnson and the band after Bon Scott died, really listen to these albums, really read these lyrics, really be honest about it, and give Brian Johnson some credit. According to Angus Young, there is some Bon Scott lyrics in Back in Black, but I really just think it's just a little bit of lyrics and a lot of influence that Brian and the boys harnessed and helped him create and record arguably the greatest rock and roll record of all time, even if I like Powerage and For Those About to Rock better. But I'm wrong. I should like Back in Black the best. I mean, objectively speaking, it's the album that has everything. It's got the Young brothers, it's got Brian writing, it's got some contributions from Bon Scott. So it's like the ultimate AC/DC album. It's both a Bon Scott and Brian Johnson era AC/DC album. So instead of knocking it and knocking the band, how about you just embrace and love the album? And actually, don't be a poser. Buy their other albums too. Buy For Those About to Rock, Resalute You. Because if you think Back in Black is so goddamn great, well, For Those About to Rock, Resalute You is its sequel, and no album in the history of albums has ever sounded so much like Back in Black than For Those About to Rock, Resalute You. So buy that goddamn album, listen to my podcast, subscribe to my channel, like this video. Even if you don't like it, and then give me a negative comment. I allow negative comments on my videos. I always check the box because I want to have a conversation. I love different opinions. Hell, even if you're Jesse Fink out there, leave a comment. Leave me a link to that Rolling Stone Australian interview where Angus Young said all that sus shit. I welcome the debate. Let's talk about this in the comments section. Thank you for watching, and rock and roll.